Snowflakes fell softly, covering the narrow streets in a thick white blanket. The wind howled through the alleys, cutting through even the thickest of clothing. But for a young girl with torn shoes and a thin, ragged coat, the cold felt like 1,000 needles against her skin. Her small, trembling hands clutched her empty stomach as she shuffled through the icy streets. She was only 10, but life had forced her to grow up fast. She had no home, no family, and no one to call her own. Each night she curled up in a corner of a crumbling brick wall, shivering through the long, bitter hours. Hunger gnawed at her insides, a constant, cruel companion. As she passed the warm glow of a small bakery, the smell of fresh bread reached her nose. It was a simple thing, just the scent of freshly baked loaves, but to her it felt like a glimpse into another world. Her mouth watered, and her stomach growled loudly as if the smell alone could fill her empty belly. Inside, the baker, a tall man with thick arms and a hard face, was busy stacking warm, crusty bread on wooden shelves. He didn't notice the small, wide-eyed girl standing outside, her nose pressed against the frosted glass. For a moment she hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what she was about to do was wrong. But hunger has a way of blurring the lines between right and wrong. Quickly, she pushed open the heavy door, the warm air hitting her face like a comforting hug. The shelves seemed to glow with golden loaves and sweet pastries, a feast for the eyes. She glanced around, her small heart racing. The baker had just turned his back to carry a tray to the counter. Without thinking twice, her small hand shot out, grabbing a loaf of bread. She clutched it to her chest like a precious treasure and darted back toward the door. But as she reached for the handle, the baker's sharp voice cut through the warm air. "Hey, thief!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. The girl's heart froze. She turned, her large, frightened eyes meeting the baker's furious glare. In 2 quick strides, he crossed the floor and grabbed her by the wrist. His grip was like iron, and the bread slipped from her trembling hands, falling to the ground. "Stealing from me? You little street rat," he snarled, his face twisted with anger. "You think you can just walk in here and take what you want?" The girl opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Fear had stolen her voice. Her body shook, not just from the cold, but from the terror of what might come next. The baker dragged her outside, ignoring her weak attempts to pull free. The cold hit her like a slap, and the wind whipped her hair into her face. Before she could even catch her breath, the baker shoved her against the brick wall. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a thick piece of rope. "If you want to steal, then you can stay out here and think about what you've done," he growled. With rough hands, he tied her wrists together, then secured the rope to an old iron post beside his shop. The rope cut into her thin wrists and the cold iron burned against her skin. She twisted and turned, but the knots were too tight. The snow fell heavier now, flakes settling on her hair and eyelashes, melting into icy droplets against her cheeks. The baker stepped back, dusting his hands as if he had just finished a hard day's work. He spat at her feet and slammed the door. Behind him, the warm light disappearing as quickly as it had come. For a long moment, the girl just stood there, shivering, her breath coming out in white puffs. Tears filled her eyes, freezing on her cheeks as they fell. She had nothing left, no warmth, no food, no freedom. As minutes turned to hours, her body grew numb, and her mind slipped into a hazy, dreamlike state. She no longer felt the biting, cold as sharply, and her eyes grew heavy. Just as darkness threatened to pull her under completely, she heard the crunch of footsteps on the snow. Faint at first, but slowly growing louder, a figure emerged from the swirling white flakes, tall with a long coat flapping in the icy wind. The stranger paused, his sharp eyes catching the sight of the small, trembling figure tied to the post. For a moment he stood still, watching. The girl, the snow gathering around his boots. What would he do? Would he walk past like so many others? Or would this be the beginning of something she never dared to dream of? The answer, for now, lay hidden in the cold, silent snow. The snow continued to fall, thick and heavy, covering the girl in a thin white blanket. Her breath came in short, painful gasps, each one cutting into her chest like broken glass. Her fingers, tied tightly together, had long since gone numb, and her head drooped forward, her energy slipping away. As she drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind flickered with memories of better days, the soft, warm touch of her mother's hand, the sound of laughter, the smell of home. But those memories felt like dreams now, distant and unreachable. Then through the haze she heard it, the steady crunching sound of boots against snow. The sound grew louder, breaking through the swirling wind and the pounding in her head. She forced her eyes open, squinting against the falling flakes. A tall figure emerged from the snowy mist, walking slowly, his head bent against the icy wind. He wore a long, dark coat, its collar pulled up against his neck, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. The stranger's steps were steady, purposeful, as if the cold did not touch him. He paused a few feet away, his sharp eyes locking onto the small, shivering form tied to the post. For a moment he said nothing, simply watching the girl, his breath visible in the frigid air. The girl tried to straighten, to pull against the ropes, but her strength was gone. Her lips trembled, the words frozen in her throat. Would this man help her, or simply walk past like so many others had before? The stranger took a step closer, the snow crunching loudly beneath his boots. His face remained hidden in the shadow of his hat, but his eyes, sharp and clear, never left the girl. He leaned down, examining the rough knots that held her wrists together. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice low but firm, cutting through the wind like a blade. The girl's eyes filled with fresh tears, but she could only manage a weak, shaky breath in response. The stranger's jaw tightened, his gloved hands reaching out to touch the icy rope. He tested the knot, his fingers moving with surprising gentleness. At that moment, the bakery door burst open with a loud crash, and the baker stormed out, his face red with anger. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his breath puffing out in white clouds. "Leave her. That thief needs to learn a lesson." The stranger straightened, slowly turning to face the baker. He stood a full head taller, his broad shoulders blocking the wind like a wall. For a long, tense moment, neither man spoke. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the snow swirling around them like a frozen dance. The baker crossed his thick arms, his small eyes narrowing. "She stole from me," he spat. "A dirty little thief trying to take my bread. I'm teaching her a lesson." The stranger tilted his head slightly, the shadows on his face shifting. "Teaching her a lesson," he repeated, his voice calm but laced with a quiet, dangerous edge. "By leaving a child to freeze in the snow." The baker hesitated, the stranger's icy stare cutting through his bluster. For a moment the large man shifted on his feet, his confidence wavering. But then he straightened, puffing out his chest. "It's none of your business, stranger," he snapped. "Go on your way. This is my shop, my property, and my right to deal with thieves as I see fit." The stranger took a slow, deliberate step forward, the snow crunching beneath his boots. He leaned in closer, his breath misting in the cold air between them. "Untie her," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, "or you'll regret it." The baker's face turned a shade darker, his fists clenching at his sides. He opened his mouth to shout, but the stranger raised one gloved hand, cutting him off. "Or," the stranger continued, his voice still dangerously calm, "I can make this a matter for the town guards. I wonder how they'll feel about a man leaving a child to die in the snow." For a moment, the only sound was the wind howling between the buildings, a lonely, mournful song. The baker's eyes flicked nervously to the street, where a few curious faces had begun to peek out from their warm homes, drawn by the commotion. The baker's jaw worked furiously, but he said nothing. His eyes darted back to the stranger, whose gaze remained cold and unblinking. Finally, with a frustrated grunt, the baker stepped forward, yanking at the icy ropes. The girl's wrists fell free, and she collapsed to the ground, her thin frame crumpling like a broken bird. The stranger knelt beside her, gently pulling her into a sitting position. His gloved hands moved carefully, brushing the snow from her hair and shoulders. He slipped his long, dark coat from his shoulders, wrapping it around the girl's shivering form. "You'll pay for this," the baker hissed, backing away toward his shop. "You'll see. I won't forget this." The stranger didn't respond. He simply lifted the girl into his arms, cradling her against his chest as he rose to his full height. Without another glance at the furious baker, he turned and began walking. Down the snow-covered street, his dark figure slowly disappearing into the white mist. The girl's head rested weakly against his chest, her eyes fluttering closed as the warmth of his coat and his steady, strong heartbeat pulled her back from the edge of darkness. For the first time in a long while, the cold no longer felt so sharp, and the darkness seemed a little less overwhelming. The cold wind whipped around them as the stranger carried the young girl through the snow-covered streets. She lay limp in his arms, her thin body shivering under his long dark coat. Her pale cheeks were smudged with dirt, and her tiny hands clutched the thick fabric like a lifeline. The stranger walked with purpose, his boots crunching through the deep snow, each step firm and steady. He moved quickly, his head down against the wind, his breath misting in the freezing air. The storm had grown stronger, the wind howling through the narrow alleys like a wild animal. Finally, he reached a small, secluded corner of the town, where the buildings leaned together as if for warmth. The dim, flickering light of an old tavern glowed through the frosted windows, casting long shadows across the snow-covered street. The stranger pushed the heavy wooden door open with his shoulder, the warmth and noise of the tavern spilling out into the cold night. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of smoke, roasted meat, and cheap ale. Rough-looking men crowded around, wooden tables, their voices loud and their laughter rough. The fire crackled in the large stone hearth, casting a warm, golden glow over the cracked walls and worn floors. The stranger carried the girl to a corner near the fire, gently laying her down on a soft, worn bench. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. With quick, practiced movements, he untied the drawstring, pouring a handful of copper and silver coins into his palm. A plump, middle-aged woman in a stained apron approached, her hands resting on her wide hips. She gave the stranger a curious look, her eyes drifting to the pale, shivering girl on the bench. "What's this, then?" she asked, raising one bushy eyebrow. "Bringing a street rat into my tavern?" The stranger met her gaze, his eyes sharp and steady. Without a word, he held out his hand, letting the coins clink into her outstretched palm. "She needs food," he said, his deep voice cutting through the noisy room. "And something warm to drink." The woman eyed the coins, then glanced back at the girl, her expression softening slightly. She pocketed the money with a quick, practiced movement and nodded. "Aye, I'll see to it," she said, turning toward the kitchen, her wide hips swaying as she bustled off. The stranger knelt beside the girl, his dark coat still draped around her small frame. He gently brushed a lock of damp hair from her face, his fingers careful and precise. Her eyes flickered open, large and frightened, the dark circles beneath them standing out against her pale skin. "You're safe now," he said, his voice low but firm. "You're inside, away from the cold." The girl blinked up at him, her vision still blurry, her mind slow to grasp what was happening. For a moment she simply stared at him, her lips parting in a silent question. "Why?" she managed to whisper, her voice weak and hoarse from the cold. "Why did you help me?" The stranger's eyes softened, a hint of something unspoken flickering in their dark depths. He glanced around the noisy tavern, then leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because no one else would," he said simply. Before the girl could respond, the plump woman returned, carrying a steaming bowl of thick stew and a small, battered tin cup filled with warm, spiced milk. She placed the food on the small, wobbly table beside the bench, her eyes lingering on the girl for a moment before she bustled away, her apron swishing behind her. The stranger reached for the bowl, carefully lifting the spoon to the girl's cracked blue lips. She hesitated, her eyes darting from the spoon to his face as if expecting some cruel trick. "It's all right," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "Eat. You need your strength." Slowly, the girl opened her mouth, letting the warm, rich stew slide over her tongue. The taste hit her like a shock, a burst of warmth and flavor after weeks of stale bread and cold water. She took another bite, then another, the warmth spreading through her thin, aching body like a comforting embrace. As she ate, the stranger sat back, watching her carefully, his dark eyes unreadable. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, worn leather notebook. With quick, precise movements, he flipped it open, his eyes scanning the small, neat writing on the yellowed pages. After a few minutes, he closed the notebook with a soft snap and slipped it back into his pocket. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the girl's, his face growing serious. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice firm but gentle. The girl hesitated, her spoon pausing halfway to her mouth. For a moment she seemed to struggle, her eyes flicking to the door as if considering a sudden escape. But then, something in the stranger's calm, steady gaze seemed to melt her fear, and she whispered a single, shaky word. "Lila," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. The stranger nodded, his face unreadable. "All right, Lila," he said, leaning back in his chair, his eyes never leaving her face. "I have a proposal for you." The girl's eyes widened, her small fingers tightening around the edge of the warm, worn blanket the stranger had wrapped around her. "A proposal?" she whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. The stranger smiled, a small, secretive curve of his lips. "Yes," he said quietly. "But first, you must promise me one thing." Lila's breath caught in her throat, her heart thudding in her chest as she waited for his next words. "Promise me," the stranger said, his dark eyes shining, with an intense, unspoken emotion, "that you will never let this world break you." The fire crackled behind them, casting long, flickering shadows on the worn wooden floor, and the storm outside continued to howl, its icy breath rattling the windows. Lila nodded slowly, her small, dirty fingers gripping the stranger's coat, a little tighter, the warmth in her chest spreading, filling the dark, empty corners of her broken heart. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the dim tavern, its warm glow casting dancing shadows across the walls. Lila leaned back against the worn wooden bench, her small, thin frame wrapped tightly in the stranger's dark coat. She held the battered tin cup of warm, spiced milk in both hands, the heat soothing her frozen fingers. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt warmth, not just from the fire but from the stranger's presence. He sat across from her, his sharp eyes studying her every move. Despite his calm expression, there was a deep, quiet intensity in his gaze, as if he could see straight into her soul. Outside, the storm continued to howl, the wind rattling the tavern's old frost-covered windows. The muffled voices of the other patrons mixed with the clinking of mugs and the crackle of the fire, creating a warm, comforting hum. Lila sipped the spiced milk slowly, her eyes flicking nervously to the stranger every few seconds. She still couldn't fully understand why he had helped her, why he had risked angering the baker to save a dirty, half-starved street girl. After a long, tense silence, the stranger leaned forward, his gloved hands resting on the rough, scratched surface of the table. "You must have questions," he said, his voice low but clear. "And I expect you have a story as well." Lila froze, her small hands tightening around the warm cup. Her mind raced, memories flashing through her head. The warmth of her mother's embrace, the sound of her father's deep laugh, the day they disappeared, and the long, cold nights that had followed. She looked down at the steaming liquid in her cup, her throat tightening. She wanted to speak, to tell this stranger her story, but the words felt heavy, tangled like knotted rope in her chest. Seeing her hesitation, the stranger leaned back slightly, his intense gaze softening. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said quietly. "But if you want to be free, to find a better life, you must let go of your fear. You must learn to trust again." Lila's heart twisted at his words. Trust. It was a word she had almost forgotten, a feeling she had buried, deep along with the pain of her past. She took a deep, shaky breath, her small fingers trembling around the warm cup. Finally, she forced herself to look up, meeting the stranger's steady gaze. "My name is Leela," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. I had a family once, a mother, a father, a little brother." The stranger's eyes remained fixed on her, his expression unreadable but patient, encouraging. "We lived in a small house at the edge of town," she continued, her voice gaining a little strength. "My father was a carpenter, my mother a seamstress. We weren't rich, but we had each other." She paused, her eyes growing distant as the memories flowed back, sharp and clear, like broken glass cutting through her mind. But then, "The sickness came," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It swept through the town like a dark cloud. My mother fell ill first, then my father. They grew weaker every day, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. My brother and I tried to care for them, but we were just children." Lila's small shoulders trembled, her fingers tightening around the cup until her knuckles turned white. "They died within days of each other," she continued, her voice breaking. "Our house became a dark, empty shell, their voices just echoes in the silence." The stranger's jaw tightened, his gloved hands clenching slightly, but he remained silent, letting the girl's words pour out. "After they were gone, my brother and I were left alone," Lila said, her eyes dropping back to her cup. "We tried to survive, selling my mother's clothes, my father's tools, anything we could find. But the money ran out quickly, and the cold came, harsh and unforgiving. Tears filled her eyes, spilling over her dirt-streaked cheeks, freezing into tiny crystals as they touched her skin. One night my brother grew too weak," she whispered, her voice. The storm outside had not eased. Icy winds whipped against the tavern's cracked windows, shaking the fragile glass in their frames. Snow piled high against the door, blocking the harsh world outside. Inside, however, the air was warm and thick, with the comforting smell of burning wood, roasted meat, and the occasional clinking of mugs. Lila leaned back against the rough wooden bench, her small frame still wrapped in the stranger's long, dark coat. The warmth from the fire had brought color back to her pale cheeks, and her hands, once blue and stiff from the cold, now felt alive again, tingling with returning blood. The stranger sat across from her, his sharp eyes watching her carefully, as if studying a rare, fragile creature. In his hands he held the small leather notebook he had taken out earlier, the edges of its worn pages darkened by time and frequent use. He flipped through it slowly, his gaze flicking from the words on the page to the small, shivering girl before him. Finally, he snapped the notebook shut and leaned forward, his dark eyes meeting Lila's uncertain gaze. "You have a choice now, Lila," he said, his deep voice cutting through the warm, smoky air. "You can stay on these streets, struggling each day just to survive, or you can come with me. I can offer you something better, a chance to live, to find purpose again." Lila's small hands tightened around the tin cup of warm, spiced milk. The stranger's words echoed in her mind, stirring something deep and long buried. A faint, flickering hope she had tried so hard to forget. She glanced around the tavern, at the rough, unshaven faces, the dark, smoke-stained walls, the flickering firelight that cast long, dancing shadows. She had spent so many nights like this, huddled, in cold corners, her stomach aching with hunger, her body stiff with cold. She had grown used to the harsh whispers of passing strangers, the angry shouts of guards, the sharp, stinging slaps of shopkeepers catching her with a stolen loaf or a handful of dried meat. Could she truly leave all this behind? Could she trust this stranger, this mysterious man with his dark coat and sharp eyes, who had pulled her from the icy clutches of death and wrapped her in warmth and protection? The stranger leaned back slightly, sensing her hesitation. "I understand your fear," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving her face. "You've been hurt, abandoned, left to fend for yourself. But I promise you this. If you choose to, come with me, you will never be alone again." Lila's heart twisted at his words, her mind racing with memories. Her brother's pale, lifeless face, Her parents' weak, whispered goodbyes, the long, lonely nights in the cold, the harsh stares of those who passed her by, ignoring her desperate pleas for help. She bit her lip, her small fingers trembling around the cup. But, "Why?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Why would you help me? Why do you care what happens to a girl like me?" For a moment, the stranger's expression shifted, a shadow passing over his face. His dark eyes grew distant, as if looking at something far beyond the smoky walls of the tavern, something hidden deep in his past. "Because," he said slowly, his voice tight with some unspoken emotion, "once, someone saved me. Someone pulled me from the darkness when I had no one, when I had nothing. They taught me that even the smallest spark can light a fire in the coldest of hearts." Lila's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening. She had never thought of the stranger as anything but strong, unbreakable, a force of nature that had cut through the storm to find her. The idea that he, too, had once been weak, vulnerable, alone. It shook her, shattered the icy walls she had built around her heart. She lowered her eyes, her small fingers picking nervously at the frayed edge of the dark coat that still clung to her thin shoulders. I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore." The stranger's jaw tightened, his gloved hands clenching slightly on the table. For a long, tense moment, he said nothing, the fire crackling softly beside them, the storm howling outside like a restless spirit. Finally, he reached out, his gloved hand resting gently on her thin, trembling fingers. His touch was warm, strong, steady, a lifeline in the darkness, a small but undeniable sign of hope. "I'm not asking for your trust right away," he said quietly, his dark eyes filled with a deep, quiet resolve. "But I am offering you a choice, a chance to rebuild, to find something better than this cold, empty life." Lila's heart raced, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions, 1,000 doubts. Could she really do it? Could she let herself believe in something better, something brighter than the dark, lonely streets she had called home for so long? Slowly, she lifted her eyes to meet the stranger's steady, unflinching gaze. "Where would we go?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What would we do?" The stranger's lips curved into a small, secretive smile, his dark eyes shining with a quiet, unspoken promise. "There is a place," he said, leaning in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "A place called Hope. It's a small, hidden haven for those who have lost everything, for those who still have a spark of life left in them. It's a place where you can find warmth, friendship, and a chance to start again." Lila's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. Hope. The word felt strange on her tongue, foreign, almost forgotten. But in that moment, as the fire crackled softly beside them, and the storm continued to rage outside, she felt something stirred deep within her. A faint flickering light, a fragile but unbreakable spark. Slowly she nodded, her small, dirty fingers tightening around the stranger's strong, steady hand. "All right," she whispered, her voice shaking but filled with a new quiet strength. "I'll go with you." The stranger's eyes softened, his small, secretive smile widening ever so slightly. "Then let us leave this place," he said, rising to his feet and pulling his dark coat tighter around her thin shoulders. "And find a new beginning." The stranger stepped forward, his boots thudding softly against the creaking floorboards. He reached for the small, battered table, his gloved hands moving quickly and precisely as he swept the scattered papers into a neat pile, his sharp eyes never leaving Lila's small, trembling form. "Sit," he said quietly, his deep voice cutting through the heavy silence. Lila hesitated, her wide, frightened eyes darting nervously around the shadowed room. She felt like a small, cornered animal, her heart racing, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Sensing her fear, the stranger's sharp eyes softened, his gloved hand resting gently on the back of the small wooden chair beside the table. "You have nothing to fear here," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "This place is safe. No one will harm you." Slowly, hesitantly, Lila stepped forward, her small, dirty fingers tightening around the edge of his dark coat. She lowered herself into the small wooden chair, her thin frame sinking into the worn, creaking wood. The stranger reached for the small, battered kettle resting on the corner of the table, his gloved hands moving with quick, practiced precision as he poured a small stream of steaming, dark liquid into a chipped porcelain cup. "Drink," he said quietly, pushing the cup toward her. "It will warm you." Lila reached for the cup, her small, trembling hands wrapping around the warm, smooth porcelain. She lifted it to her lips, the strong, bitter taste of the hot tea filling her mouth, warming her throat, spreading a pleasant, comforting heat through her cold, aching body. As she drank, the stranger sat down across from her, his sharp, intense eyes watching her carefully, his dark, shadowed face unreadable. "We have much to discuss, Lila," he said, his voice low but firm, the flickering lamplight casting long, twisting shadows across his sharp, angular features. "And not much time." Lila lowered the cup, her small heart pounding in her chest, her wide, frightened eyes locked on the stranger's intense, shadowed face. For the first time in a long while, she felt the faint, flickering spark of hope burning in her heart. A small, fragile flame, struggling to survive in the darkness but refusing to be extinguished. The small room felt warmer now, the faint, flickering glow of the oil lamp casting soft, golden light over the rough, weathered walls. Lila sat in the creaking wooden chair, her small, thin frame still wrapped tightly in the stranger's long, dark coat. She cradled the chipped porcelain cup in her small hands, the warmth of the bitter, dark tea spreading through her body, chasing away the last traces of the bitter, icy cold. Across the small, battered table, the stranger leaned forward, his sharp, shadowed face lit by the flickering lamplight. His dark eyes were fixed on Lila, their intense, unblinking gaze filled with a strange, unspoken determination. He reached for the small brass compass lying on the table, his gloved fingers brushing against the cool, polished metal. The tiny needle quivered, pointing steadily north, its thin black point cutting through the soft golden light. "We leave at first light," he said quietly, his deep voice cutting through the heavy silence. "The road to hope is long and dangerous, and we must reach the first checkpoint before the snow thickens." Lila's small hands tightened around the cup, her wide, frightened eyes darting nervously to the small, frosted window beside the door. Outside, the wind howled softly, the snow-covered streets shrouded in darkness, the shadows deep and twisting. "But what is hope?" she whispered, her small voice trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. Is it really a place, or just a dream?" For a moment, the stranger's sharp, intense gaze softened, his dark eyes flickering with a faint, unspoken sadness. He leaned back slightly, his gloved hands resting on the rough, scratched surface of the table. "Hope is real," he said quietly, his deep voice filled with a strange, quiet conviction. "It is a place, hidden deep in the mountains, far from the cold, harsh streets of this dying town. It is a haven for those who have lost everything, for those who still have a spark of life left in them." Lila's breath caught in her throat, her small heart pounding faster, her wide, frightened eyes locked on the stranger's shadowed face. "But how do you know it's real?" she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. The stranger's jaw tightened, his gloved hands clenching slightly on the table. For a long, tense moment, he said nothing, his sharp, shadowed face unreadable in the flickering lamplight. Finally, he reached into his coat, pulling out the small leather notebook she had seen before. He flipped it open, his dark eyes scanning, the small, neat writing on the yellowed pages. "I know it's real," he said quietly, his voice tight with some unspoken emotion. "Because I have seen it with my own eyes. I have walked its hidden paths, climbed its steep, frozen cliffs, felt the warmth of its fires, heard the laughter of its people." Lila's heart twisted at his words, her small fingers trembling around the warm, chipped cup. She wanted to believe, him to trust in the warmth of his promise, but years of fear and pain had left deep, jagged scars on her young heart. "But what if we don't make it?" she whispered, her small voice shaking. What if we freeze in the snow? What if the guards catch us? What if we fail? The stranger's dark eyes met hers, his sharp, shadowed face filled with a deep, quiet resolve. Then we die with our heads held high, he said quietly, his deep voice cutting through the heavy, shadowed air. We die with the knowledge that we tried, that we fought for something better, that we did not give up. Lila's small, trembling hands tightened around the cup, her wide, frightened eyes filling with tears. She had spent so long fighting, struggling, clawing her way through the darkness, her small, fragile heart hardened by fear and pain. But now, for the first time in a long while, she felt the faint, flickering spark of hope burning in her chest, a small, fragile flame, struggling to survive in the darkness but refusing to be extinguished. Slowly, she lowered the cup, her small, trembling fingers wrapping around the edge of the stranger's dark coat, her wide, frightened eyes locking onto his sharp, intense gaze. I'll go with you, she whispered, her small voice filled with a new, quiet strength. I'll fight. I'll try. The stranger's dark eyes softened, a small, secretive smile flickering at the corners of his thin, shadowed lips. He reached out, his gloved hand resting gently on her small, trembling fingers, his touch warm and steady. Then let us leave this place, he said quietly, his deep voice filled with a quiet, unshakable determination, and find our way to hope. As the fire crackled softly beside them, and the shadows danced on the rough, weathered walls, Lila felt the warmth in her chest spread a little further, melting the icy fear that had wrapped itself around her heart. For so long, she did not know what lay ahead, what dangers they would face, what trials they would endure. But for the first time in a long, cold, lonely while, she felt the faint, flickering spark of hope burning bright in her heart. A small, fragile flame, struggling to survive in the darkness but refusing to be extinguished.